There we go. Three o'clock, South Africa time. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of our co-hosts, the University of Exeter, Project Empower, Institute for Global Health, the University College London, and the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, a very, very warm welcome to you all to this webinar on co-developing interventions to address violence against women and violence against girls. Before we get started, just some really quick housekeeping. The webinar is going to be recorded so we can share it with you after the event, and it will be made available by the S3 update and the websites of our co-hosts as well as ourselves, the S3RI. We would love you to take this opportunity while I'm doing the intro notes to really introduce yourself in the chat so we know who is on the call with us today. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please write them in the Q&A function of the webinar. We've had over 530 registrations for this webinar. We're just so delighted. And the enthusiasm, the interest that you have shown in today's event on co-developing interventions really highlights the increasing popularity and interest in this idea of co-developing interventions. And why is that? We know that, that the resonance of this webinar is that it's that interventions that are developed jointly with the people that know what they really need on the ground do resonate with the participants, and we hope lead to better outcomes. Yet the real purpose of this webinar today is that there does remain little understanding of what co-developed interventions actually look like in practice, how they work, and there has been very little discussion to date on the challenges of this type of work. Next slide, please, Morma. So today, our wonderful panelists, Andrew Gibbs from Exeter University, Jane Ndungu from the South African Medical Research Council, Laura Washington from Project Empower, Rochelle Burgess and Genevieve Manel from the University College London. Next slide, please, Morma. We'll talk about their co-development journeys in relation to developing violence against women and girls interventions and dig deeper with us into how co-development of interventions are different to other approaches. And they will talk about the times or moments in the process of intervention design where we can bring in the concept of co-production and describe and evaluate potential methodologies and approaches to co-production at these moments. But before the panel shares, we will hear from Andy to share some practical insights from 5 projects on co-developing interventions on violence against women and girls, and provide a real framework for the discussions and presentations that will follow. And now, before handing over to Andy, Morma, who is our producer for today, will share a Mentimeter link in the chat. And we are so keen to hear your thoughts on what co-development means to you. So in one word in the Mentimeter link, can you just say in one word what co-development means to you? And your ideas and words will be shared at the end of the webinar. And you can continue to populate the Mentimeter throughout the event. Now, without any further ado and any more intros, over to you, Andy, to talk about co-development. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone for joining us. So yeah, I'm Andy Gibbs. I'm at the University of Exeter. So what I wanted to do is kind of start by giving a bit of a framework for thinking about what is co-development and how does it differ from other approaches to intervention development. This is obviously something that we're starting to grapple with collectively, and these thoughts and ideas are something that kind of we've come up with together. So it's something we're just starting to make sense of, and then each one of us will talk a little about kind of our own projects of co-development and how it resonates or doesn't with this framework. So next slide, please. Sorry, Mama, could I get the next slide? And yeah, thanks. So I'll talk about the framework and then apply it to one project, which many of us, almost all of us on the panel actually, almost all of us have been involved in Siyapambile Youth, which has been in South Africa. Next slide, please. So just to kind of give a bit of kind of some words, a sense of what we're talking about. So as kind of Liz has hinted about, co-production refers to this moment where academics, participants and practitioners come together as somewhat equal partners to address a range of research issues, from knowledge generation and creation to the development and creation of services. And within that, we see co-development of a subset, as a subset of co-production. And we really are referring to the co-production of intervention. So when we say co-development, we're referring to co-development of interventions. As Liz has also mentioned, there are many benefits of co-development. You know, the literature is quite extensive on this. There's obviously this ethical imperative that we need to involve those who interventions target, for want of a better word. And it's likely to generate better interventions which resonate more with people's lives. And then one of the things which isn't often talked about, but we want to try and think of the ways in which co-production can reorientate interventions. Often interventions are very focused on risk factors and addressing risk factors. But what we want to do is say, yes, that's important, but also think about how we can identify spaces for agency which people themselves think they can take, and build those spaces for agency. Okay, next slide, please. So obviously, you know, there's lots of guidance on how to develop effective interventions to address violence against women and girls. And what we're not trying to do is displace any of that, but rather kind of think how co-development of interventions can resonate and build on and enhance these kind of things. So I've flagged a range of critical guidance, you know, about how to do good violence prevention interventions and how to think about this. So we need to think of this as building and kind of enhancing that rather than replacing. And a lot of this work has been, and the thinking around the framework has been built on stuff that Genevieve and ourselves have been working on in South Africa. So I just wanted to flag that too. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of give you a sense of what this framework starts to try and do and look at. I guess one thing is we see co-development of interventions as a process, but to try and make it manageable and to think about, to talk about, we've decided to focus on 6 critical moments, which does seem like there are 6 singular points where we can think about co-development and what that might look like. Rather, we need to see it as a process and not a simple kind of process. But for simplicity's sake, to make it meaningful and kind of manageable and to try and give something that people can start to think with, we've kind of identified these 6 critical moments. So generating intervention priorities, collecting data, so the task of it, producing knowledge, so analysing data, theories of change, which often underpin many interventions these days, intervention development, and then piloting. So what I'll do now is kind of start to speak about each of those and try and disentangle what might a traditional kind of approach to intervention development be, what might a participatory approach be, and then try and say how a co-development approach would differ and may differ. Okay, next slide, please. But before we get there, we need to think about the people coming together in any co-development approach. And often we're not very clear on this, and we need to think about who it is, whether it's academics, NGOs, and participants, community members, and think about how people come into the same space with very different positions, voice, and power. And the possibilities and limitations of the co-development process are fundamentally shaped by people's different starting positions. So throughout, I'll be talking a lot about voice and power, and also creating receptive listening spaces. So I just wanted to flag that as what you'll hear from the kind of different interventions, the different processes, is that we're working with quite different groups of people, and that's critical to think about how that shapes the processes that are possible. Next slide, please. So on to the framework, or these 6 critical moments. So obviously I have, you know, and we've tried to characterize and create kind of somewhat simplified versions of these. So these aren't set in stone, and it's something we're still grappling with. But let's get into thinking about generating project or intervention priorities. So within what we want to call a traditional approach, academics will sit and review the literature, identify the gaps, and select the priorities. That's a traditional way of creating interventions. A more participatory approach would be to use a range of activities to generate insight into participants' intervention priorities and topics. But at heart, the final decision and kind of making process lies with the academics or those with the power. So a co-development process to generate project kind of priorities or intervention priorities, it would use a range of techniques, to identify potential intervention topic areas, probably participatory, but it moves beyond that, about creating processes and structures to collectively agree on what needs to be focused on. So then if we move on to collecting data, often we need to, oh, sorry, not the next slide one. Could we go back? Thank you. Sorry. Thanks. Okay, so in traditional collecting data, so the task of it, it would generally come up with a range of techniques. We, the academics, the NGO partners, potentially, arrange in-depth qualitative interviews, quantitative data collection, literature reviews. A participatory process might do peer interviews, community mapping, body mapping, but as with generating intervention priorities, the decision-making lies in the hands of the researchers. What might a co-development process look like for collecting data? It would be about working together to create tools and methodologies with equitable discussion between everyone to identify what might work for different areas, grounded in the lived realities of the participants. Okay, next slide, please. So then on to producing knowledge, so the analysis, and we've separated that from creating data because it's a different type of process. So again, in the traditional thing, caricature here, academics work individually and together to produce meaning, knowledge, and interpretation. In a more participatory approach, we might do that analysis ourselves and then feed back to participants for what we might want to call participant validation. So some of the group, the meaning is interpreted and checked by participants, but the final power rests in the hands of the academics. So what might a code development process look like? How might that look different? Obviously, it would include some feedback to participants, but greater support for participants to interpret, contextualize, and produce meaning and interpretation, and contest the meanings that the academics produce. And it would be important to enable space for new and unforeseen ideas to emerge. And here we start to have to think a lot more, and probably in earlier ones, we have to think a lot more about the skills and voice that everyone coming into the process has and would need to be able to do that. Because without building kind of participants' voices and skills and self-reflection, it's innate, people aren't going to be able to engage in a meaningful way. So then on to theories of change. Theories of change underpin interventions typically. They kind of provide an explanatory framework for how we think interventions are going to impact on different components and address kind of violence against women and girls. So in the traditional process, academics typically will use research and knowledge to produce a theory of change. A more participatory process provides space for input. It might be a one-off workshop presenting to participants, be that kind of community members or NGO partners on the academic creative theory of change. But a co-development process requires that all participants are engaged and able to critically engage with the topic, which requires critical awareness of the topic and self-reflection. So people can't just be dropped in and say, how does this mean to you? And it means that it might well be participants who generate the first theory of change and are actively engaged with it, and it's discussed in a collaborative way. And it's about thinking about the unintended bias that researchers may bring kind of to that process of theory development. Next slide, please. And then in terms of our intervention development, traditionally, academics and practitioners have created curriculum manuals, done a bit of light touch testing. A more participatory process, create space for feedback, we'll find people, organize for a group to come in and run a session, get feedback from them. I guess this is where we start to really disentangle what co-development looks like. And it requires that the people we test it with have got the ability and voice to engage in a meaningful way. So often this means they need to have been worked with previously to build up a conscious sense of what it is that they want from an intervention and have the ability and voice to say that. And in that sense, we need to also build a receptive listening environment where those of us who create interventions have to actively listen and respond to. And other processes that could be engaging participants in designing the manualized activities. And here it's where participants come from. It could be about trying multiple different evidence-based activities and adapting them, co-adapting them, or co-designing new activities from scratch, again, depending where the baseline to start with. And then what piloting might look like. So after we've developed an intervention, we need to pilot it. Traditionally, participants are the object of the intervention, or at best facilitators with short inputs and reflection. More participatory evaluation might expand the methods used with participants, identifying unexpected outcomes. But what might a co-developed pilot look like? So the participants who have been involved in the process are leading collaborators in the piloting of the intervention, and they take an active role in both piloting and analysing the intervention and assessing whether it's achieved its objectives. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do very briefly, because I know I've been talking a lot, is kind of try and apply this framework to Sia Pambile youth. It's co-developed, we got funding to co-develop interventions with young people in urban and rural communities in South Africa. So our co-development process was hiring, with Project Empower leading this process, a number of youth peer research associates, YPRAs, who we had and worked with for over 24 months to co-create, co-develop an intervention. We did a range of data collection and analysis to understand the lived realities of young people. We worked to develop a series of theories of change, so 4 reflecting men and women, urban and rural. And then we did some intervention development and intervention pre-testing. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do was try and think, how did the work of Sia Pambile Youth, how did that fit into these kind of 6 moments, and think about where it did fall short and where it did kind of push towards something more co-developed. So I guess one of at the start, if we go to generating project and intervention priorities, this is a traditional project. It was decided we needed to do this by a bunch of academics based on our previous research, and we decided this is what we can get money for. In terms of collecting data, so the task, the event of it, I guess here we used a lot more participatory methods. Working with the YPRAs, we got them to do community mapping, artifact data collection, narrative stories, a range of techniques which kind of move beyond in-depth interviews, but were decided by us as the team of researchers. As we move towards producing knowledge production, I guess we started to move towards co-development. We did do some participatory kind of things. We fed back kind of some data we collected previously for them to discuss so they could start to engage with it. We did this for some thematic analysis we did, so the YPRAs got to talk and give us feedback about that. But I think at this stage, we started to move towards a more co-development process. in the thematic analysis of qualitative data, they started to push back and can start to contest how we'd understood their data. And in artifact interviews where they'd taken photos, they started to give meaning to the photos themselves, to say this is what we meant by it, which were quite different to the interpretations we'd got of it. Next slide, please. And then in terms of theories of change, after this process, it had taken us maybe 12 months of working around data collection and data analysis, we started to move into co-creating theories of change. And there, you know, with Project Empower really driving this forward, there was a sustained and repeated engagement with the YPRAs, where they spent a lot of time mapping out and recreating theories of change. You know, we spent some time as academics sitting and listening to them as they constructed their theories of change and made sense of their world. And I think it's really important to say this was only possible because they had spent time on other tasks, building voice, building critical awareness, and building understanding of the world they lived in a way they could articulate. In terms of intervention development, again, you know, we were then working with YPRAs who are much more able and willing to voice their opinions while we did create the sessions themselves. When we started to engage with the YPRAs about the sessions and what they needed and what they wanted, they were more able and willing to kind of give us feedback, linking back and saying, yes, this is what we anticipated with the theory of change and how we envisage an intervention. So we haven't yet got to the piloting, but the way we see that, which will start in a couple of months, the YPRAs themselves will facilitate the intervention, and with any kind of process, they'll participate in ongoing review of the implementation as facilitators, as owners of that project. And we are looking at ways in which they'll form part of the formal review process of the intervention and interpretation of the analysis. So I think next slide, please. So some of this I'll talk about at a little end, but I think one of the kind of got 4 clear kind of key points. So co-development, co-creation of interventions is about creating voice and receptive listening environment. And it's got to think about how can we do that and the limits to that and the barriers to that. In Siapambile Youth, it was a lot about building voice of the YPRAs, confidence and self-reflection to make sense of their world and being able to come to articulate this, which was central to this process. I guess I just want to say before we dive into the other kind of ones, this co-development process is very varied depending on who's involved and what the aim of the project is. And in all co-development processes, there'll be challenges. And as we could see with Siapambile Youth, you know, and we can dig into the problems even further, we couldn't ever create a perfect co-development process. But it's now time for me to stop talking and to introduce the next person, as we'll go on to, I think, Laura from
Andy,
Project. Yeah.
I just want to highlight there are a couple of questions for you in the chat. So before we move into the next presentation, I just thought, can I ask you a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure.
So Uwezo has asked, the 2 critical moments of generating intervention, priorities, and collecting data, how are they different from each other? And then the next question that indicates from Ruby Ann that seems to be that there has to be a real trust relationship to this co-development approach, and who facilitates that reflexive space. And then Fabio asks, how are participants defined? And particularly if a program is reaching thousands, and if it's IPV prevention, a large percentage might be perpetrators. Would they be co-developing? And how would you manage the pushback? And would they be part of the code? Would this be part of the code design?
Yeah, great. All fabulous questions. Let me try and answer those. And if I miss one, just shout and I'll go. So I guess the difference between intervention priorities and data collection, in terms of thinking about, you know, are we going to focus on X topic? And this is kind of maybe whether or not it's going to be about violence against women and what form of violence against women you might want to think about. So whether it should focus on non-partner rape or intimate partner violence or sexual harassment. So those decisions, kind of where the overall project focus is going to be, would be about priority selection. In terms of data collection, yeah, I think this would be about generating understandings of people's lived realities. So making sense of kind of the underlying issues. So diving deep into understanding people's lived spaces. So hopefully that solves that. In terms of the question around trust, yeah, I think the big issue, and I think that's a central point and a good point, is that, yeah, trust is central. And I think we'll hear how that gets very complicated very quickly in co-development processes. But yes, in terms of building that reflective space and who does it, I guess, yeah, it's a big question. And it's about what different teams and projects look like. And I think what you'll hear from the other presentations is those kind of processes look different, who's involved, who creates that reflective space. In terms of defining participants, yeah, we probably need a better term, I realised as I spoke, because it still created an us and them kind of vibe. I think what you'll hear from all of these is that there's a tendency on co-development to work with a small number of people. And it's very hard to imagine what a co-development process would look like on a larger scale, although some of the kind of projects being talked about will talk about larger numbers, but typically we've worked with relatively few people because of building that trust, building that confidence, building that voice. To think about it, we've kind of tended to focus on small numbers. And then in terms of working with perpetrators, yeah, you know, it's one of the big things. If we're going to engage and work with men and boys who are often the main perpetrators of violence against women, or primarily the main perpetrators of violence against women and girls, we need to think of ways to do that. And the same set of questions with how do we work on interventions with men and boys around perpetration becomes central to kind of co-development with them. And I think there's lots of good guidance and about actively challenging. And I think, again, although we didn't talk about it, that's been one of the complicated things of co-developing in Siapambile youth at times. Is that all of them, hopefully?
Oh, we've got a few more, but I think we can take them after the next round of presentations. Thanks, Andy. Back to you.
Great, thanks. So yeah, so now I'm very happy to hand over to Laura Washington, who'll be talking about work which we've been involved in Durban, South Africa. So over to Laura.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Liz. And thanks to all of you for participating this afternoon. So I'm Laura Washington, the Director of Project Empower. And unlike the other panelists, I'm from an NGO and not an academic, but we have a long-standing partnership with various researchers in academic institutions. And in this September project, we partnered with Genevieve and Andy, who was then with Medical Research Council in South Africa, to work with a team of 4 young women to try to understand better their experiences of violence in intimate partnerships, and to work with them and alongside them to identify spaces where women themselves could effectively create change in those relationships to prevent violence. So next slide, please. Okay, just a little bit of background. We work mostly in the context of informal settlements, and this project was located in one specific informal settlement in the KZN province of South Africa. And the reason we have a focus on informal settlements is that we understand the extraordinary levels of violence that are experienced by people living in the settlements generally, but particularly by young women in the context of their intimate partnerships. And one study that we were part of showed that in the past 12 months, 65% of the women that we surveyed under the age of 30 had experienced an incident of intimate partner violence. So it was a big problem, and none of the interventions that we had been part of developing so far had been able to reduce women's experience of intimate partner violence, although they had been effective in reducing men's perpetration. So we realized that we were missing something with women, and we wanted to understand better what an intervention that was focused specifically on women's agency, what that intervention might look like. We thought that co-development would be a way towards this, and I think our first sort of discovery was that, unlike the presentation that Andy's just mapped out for us, a scaffold like that wasn't available to us at the time that we were conceptualizing the project, although the field has advanced a bit since then. So we were largely taking what we understood to be the theory and trying to apply it to the practice of our context and situation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk this afternoon very briefly about what we did, but I want to focus in a little bit more detail on the power dynamics that existed between the us and the them in the co-development context, and co-development obviously trying to break down the barriers between us and them and to just create a great pool of us that is searching towards a solution for a problem. But nonetheless, when we initiated the project with the young women that we were working with, there was a very clear distinction between those of us who'd been involved in the project conceptualizing and the young women that we recruited to be our associates. So we recruited and hired 4 young women, and we called them young peer research associates. None of them had worked before, and none of them had been involved in a community development initiative, for the simple reason that there was nothing happening in the community that they were living within at the time that we recruited them. And to give them a sense of status in the project, and to give them a sense of security, and also to secure their participation, we employed them, hired them, put them on the payroll of Project Empower, and paid them, compensated them for their time and their attention by giving them a basic monthly wage. The first set of activities, really the participatory research activities, where we were working with the young women to analyze their experiences. And then we moved into developing a theory of change with them that was based on their interpretation of their reality and a coding exercise done by the researchers and the academics. And it really turned into a dialogical process between the sort of 2 groups. And eventually we came up with a theory of change, which guided us towards theatre testing, what we thought was relevant, what could be relevant evidence-based interventions towards preventing intimate partner violence in this particular constituency. And following that, we developed and tested a short intervention. And that intervention, surprisingly, and I can come back to this at a later point, was aimed at improving communication skills between young couples. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a way of introducing the differences between the partners in the team, the young women, no work experience, no community development experience, and simply a very hard lived experience of repeated incidents of violence throughout their lives. And then a group of researchers and NGO workers who were relating to the young women quite some distance, and in fact, in some cases, thousands of kilometers from this lived reality. Next slide, please. Okay, so we entered into the relationship with the young women. Obviously, we recruited them. They didn't recruit us, and they didn't recruit themselves. We entered into the relationship with great open-hearted desire to engage in a partnership, in an egalitarian partnership, towards uncovering the difficulties that young women were experiencing in informal settlements in the context of their relationships, and working towards solutions. But obviously we had already defined the project, we defined the relationships, we'd set the milestones, we had a project process, and we knew exactly what it is that we were wanting to be looking at, and we thought that we had some idea about what the solutions might be as well. So the young women were on a back foot right from the start coming into this relationship, because they didn't understand what the project was about. They hadn't participated in formulating it. And from their perspective, this was a job opportunity, and one which they were very eager to embrace with both hands. Youth unemployment being exceedingly high in the areas that we're working in. Most of those young women and none of their friends, in all likelihood, would be able to look forward to secure formal sector employment in the foreseeable future. So we saw the young peer research associates as research partners, and they saw us as bosses. They were very keen to put their best foot forward and to create a really good impression, to make us understand that despite the fact that they were coming from disadvantaged circumstances, that they had very little formal education. Some of them had not even finished secondary school. None of them had tertiary education. Despite that fact, they were willing and able to engage with us in this process. When we started asking them to unpack their lived realities through the participatory activities that we had set for them, they were unsure about what to reveal. And we found that several things remained hidden right up until almost the end. And those were things that were likely to be perceived as things that would disadvantage them in an employment relationship. So revelations about drug use, perhaps, or risky alcohol consumption, or really engaging in sex for compensation, with things that the YPRAs were reticent about disclosing. And we found that through the process of engagement, we did develop trust, and the disclosures became easier on the part of the YPRAs, but it was certainly a barrier right from the beginning, and one which naively we didn't anticipate. From our side, as a sort of research and NGO team, we're experts on violence against women, especially young women in informal settlements. We realized that we had to really let go of the assumptions that we held strongly about how good knowledge was produced. Representative survey samples, mixed methods research, etc., etc. And we had to sit patiently and work with a group of 4 young women as they slowly disclosed elements of their lives that they wanted us to know about, that would help us all understand better and create something like a solution to the problem of intimate partner violence. And that was difficult and uncomfortable for us as researchers and NGO workers. We found that in the process of deepening our analysis, the researchers may not be the experts, but the YPRAs also don't have all the answers. And so we did find a lot of value in the co-development process of developing our respective analyses, putting that to each of us and really interrogating and questioning the analyses that were being presented in the attempt to move towards some kind of common understanding. And I think what we realized at the end is that we couldn't find a how-to manual on the internet for co-development, because it's actually very difficult to develop one. It's very messy and very human. And there was lots of going backwards and forwards and feeling that we'd failed and starting again and covering the same ground again, and then slowly moving forward. Next slide, please. We think that we benefited enormously from using the methodology in being able to develop this rich, nuanced understanding of young women's lives and where they saw spaces where they could effect change. I think we also developed a much better understanding of why interventions aimed at reducing violence in intimate partnerships in the particular constituency of young women living in informal settlements, why they might not work as well as we would like them to, and developing a better understanding of which elements of those interventions do in fact work well, and a clearer understanding of what interventions might be possible and acceptable and effective in the context. Next slide, please. I'm interested in the question that was raised about building trust, because I think that was a crucial element that, and it seems very simple and obvious and straightforward and basic to human relationships. But I think in the hurry to get going with the project and with all the pressures, this was implemented through the COVID pandemic, with all the pressures presented by the COVID pandemic, we were very hungry to get into the data collection process, the opportunities presented by the participatory research. And perhaps we would have benefited a lot more from just slowly building up trust and understanding between all the different partners involved in the research process. And I think next time, definitely, we would seek to structure our relationship with the YPRAs in a different way, one that did indeed compensate them for their time, one that does indeed recognize their expertise and attribute status to them in the context of the co-development project. One which compensates them for the value of their time, but not one that was an employment contract. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's just focusing in a little bit on the dynamics between the people in the NGO and the people in the research team and the young peer research associates. So thanks to Andy and Genevieve for the partnership, to my colleagues at Project Empower, to the young women involved in the research, and a huge thanks to the donors, SVRI, for your enormously generous support and your patience and human support through the whole process. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Laura. I don't know if we should pick a question out from the Q&A. I'll have a quick skim through. Quite broad questions. I want to just, based on what you've said, I guess one of the big questions is, how do you envisage that the intervention that got created in Zatembe differed from what would be created through a more traditional process?
So the interventions that, thanks Andy, the interventions that we were familiar with and that we had been part of developing and trialing in the past had worked with young men and young women separately, bringing them together at sort of critical points, but definitely organized separately in separate peer groups. We as researchers and NGO workers viewed young people, and this is, we were talking about people under the age of 25, so definitely young adults over the age of 18, but under the age of 25, and we viewed their relationships, I guess, with the prejudiced eyes of adults, of older adults, as being very flimsy, very temporary, very transient. We were aware of all the literature that's been written copiously for like the last 15, 20 years about multiple partnerships, concurrent partnerships, transactional relationships. And we didn't really think at all that we would be able to like get into young couples and work with them. And it was hugely surprising to hear from the YPRAs that this is in fact what they wanted. They wanted a couples intervention. They wanted their relationships to be put under the spotlight. They wanted to be able to participate in an intervention that acknowledged their relationships, that prized their relationships, and that gave them the skills to be able to conduct a relationship with one another. So that was the biggest surprising thing. And we were like, the us side, the researchers and NGO workers were not just surprised, but I think also gently resistant to the idea. But there was an insistence from the YPRAs that this is the direction that they wanted to go in.
Great, thanks, Laura. That's great, and thank you for the presentation. I think we need to move on now to our next presenter, who is Genevieve Manel, who is an associate prof at UCL and is currently residing in Samoa, where she's working on this project. So thanks, Genevieve, for getting up at an earthly hour to talk to us.
Thanks, Andy. And hello, everyone. So most of my work really looks at preventing violence against women in the world's highest prevalent settings. So this includes the Pacific region, but it also includes Afghanistan, indigenous communities in Peru, informal settlements as part of the CM project that Andy and Laura have just talked about in South Africa. And with all of this work, I'm really interested in sort of questions of participation and collective agency. So really, in other words, how do we create sustainable interventions through getting people to co-design their own community-based interventions to prevent violence against women and girls? So I'll talk a little bit about what exactly that entails as I go along. But just to say, I'm currently based in Samoa. It's almost 3 in the morning, so you have to bear with me a little bit throughout this. But here we're really working with local communities to co-develop an intervention to prevent violence that's called Elesawa Lealofa, which means love shouldn't hurt in English. So next slide, please, Norma. So where on earth is Samoa? Some of you probably know the answer to this question, but perhaps not everyone. So Samoa is a small group of islands in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. It's close to Fiji and Tonga. It has a population of about 200,000 people. So the same equivalent to sort of a small town in other countries. And it has a culture that really goes back 3,000 years, which plays a big role in thinking about violence prevention. Samoa was first colonized by the Germans, and then after World War I was given to the New Zealand government to administer until about 1962 when it gained its independence. But unlike other countries that have really experienced colonization, Samoa has really retained much of its social and cultural traditions and is really a fierce protector of Va'a Samoa, or the Samoan way, as they call it. It's also a high prevalence setting. So the most recent demographic and health survey data from 2020 showed that 39.6% of women had experienced physical, sexual, or emotional violence in their lifetime, with 31.5% experiencing in the past 12 months. Next slide, please. So with our research here in Samoa, we're really interested in asking a slightly different kind of research question. So it's not only about whether co-production helps make research more democratic or improves the participation of local actors, but can co-production actually help reduce violence against women and girls in high prevalence settings? So in other words, does the participation of communities in intervention design matter? Will it actually have an impact on violence that might be better or improve outcomes? Next slide, please. So I always feel a bit strange talking about this project. I'm really mostly the vocal point piece. This is the team that's really doing all of the work here in Samoa. So this is a picture of our local partner organization, the Samoa Victim Support Group, or commonly called SVSG. And They are the leading organization supporting women and girls experiencing violence in Samoa. This is our team of 30 community-based researchers who we tend to call the EVE team. So that stands for Evidence for Violence Prevention in the Extreme, EVE. And our EVE team is composed of 1 man, 1 woman, and 1 community elder from 10 villages across the country. And they meet every few months to really learn about research, develop research skills, and then use those new skills to collect data from their villages. Up to this point, our aim has really been to produce research on community perceptions of violence. So understanding the lived experience that Andy was talking about, and to find local strategies for its prevention. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So next slide, please. So we really tried to enable or embed co-production into every stage of this research. And I've used Andy's categories here to talk about how we've done this. So the EVE team, our 30 community-based researchers, have collected their own data about different forms of violence happening in their villages and really what people perceive as the solutions for addressing it. We then took their findings, so synthesized their findings, but we took the findings back to the communities, the 10 communities we're working with, in order to hold sort of open discussions about violence prevention and what the broader community thought about what the community-based researchers found. And when it's called locally a talanoa, so an open conversation that's very democratic and has very specific rules around who speaks and when in the Pacific context, but that everybody gets a chance to speak is sort of at the base of the talanoa. And at the same time as talking really about solutions to violence, we also asked communities questions about what they expected from us in terms of protecting and supporting survivors. And we used this to develop some ethical guidelines for how our project would actually engage with local communities. In developing our theory of change, we held a series of focus groups asking about meaningful changes that women who were survivors of violence wanted to see in their own lives. So what were the types of violence and levels of severity that they wanted us to address as part of this project? And they told us, quite interestingly, I think this resonates with other parts of the world as well, that emotional violence was by far the worst that they could experience, and that it had the most detrimental outcomes on their own lives and their health. And so we've decided to use this as really our primary outcome for piloting and evaluation. So it's all focused on emotional violence and addressing emotional violence. And then we have other secondary outcomes of different kinds of violence. So once we finish data collection for the pilot, we will take, so this is sort of where we are at in the project, we'll take this data back to the same communities, so these same 10 communities, using visual participatory analysis, or VPA. So this is an approach to really visually representing quantitative findings in user-friendly ways, because I think these can often be difficult to understand or interpret, particularly for people who have had different education or part of education systems that are quite different. And we're hoping that these visual participatory analysis will really help us gain understanding and reflect on the community's perspective around violence and what we found, around how it might be reduced or how we can co-produce it. So finally, I think the most innovative and exciting aspect of this entire project to me is the intervention itself. So our intervention is actually a co-production intervention. And it's one that was really first developed in the Peruvian Amazon with some funding from SVRI actually back in 2017. So I'll talk a little bit about that intervention. So next slide, please, Norma. So the reason I think this intervention is really exciting and novel is that rather than selecting an existing intervention and then adapting it for Samoa, our intervention works instead with our local community-based researchers, so our EVE team, to select and adapt potential activities that they can use to prevent violence in their communities from what is a manual of possibilities. So each potential activity that we've included in the manual is from the wider evidence base that we now have around interventions that have been actually shown to reduce violence against women elsewhere in the world. And our team of community-based researchers try out these activities first for themselves and then talk about and choose the ones that they want to adapt for their own villages and talk about how they might adapt those for the Samoan context in their own lives. So the activities are then implemented in each village by a trained facilitator after they've gone through this adaptation process themselves. And then at the end of the implementation process, the team comes back together to really reflect on how the activities went and what they want to do next. So building sort of an incremental pathway or building up different activities as we go. And then the cycle really repeats until we have at the end really an intervention, so a collection of streamed activities in a particular order that everyone's happy with and that they think will actually work based on their experience of implementing these activities. So in it, I think this is unique because in addition to really thinking about addressing risk factors for violence, such as social norms and gender inequalities, this approach, which we've called participatory community-led intervention development, adds co-production as really a central mechanism for why we think the intervention works and how it's going to bring about change. Okay, next slide. So this is a large project over 7 years, so we have a long time. We're currently 3 years in, so we have some time to finish, but we also have a huge responsibility, or it feels like that from this perspective. We've just finished a baseline assessment of violence prevalence across the 10 participating villages in Samoa. And this month, we're starting sort of what we've called a pre-pilot pilot. So where we're going to really test the intervention components, tease out some of the kinks before we move on to anything that remotely looks like a cluster randomized controlled design later on, if all goes well. And so that's really all for me. I want to just thank everyone who's been involved with this, particularly the Samoa Victim Support Group here in Samoa, as well as Hattie Lowe and Laura Brown, who are my team in the UK. But I also want to say that I really feel privileged to have had conversations with Andy and Laura over the last 3 years. I think we've been working on CF Pambile together because it's really shaped my thinking about all of these issues and really helped push this particular project in Samoa even further. So thanks for listening, and I'll keep you posted on how it all works out.
Great, thanks, Genevieve. We've got some direct questions. I'll ask you two from the online. So
Okay.
Alice asks, I guess this is about the impact of colonialism. If in Samoa, is there much talk about amongst the Samoans that violence against women and girls, whether they felt it was prevalent before German colonialization or something that arrived with colonialization and related to the impact of that kind of process? So how do they see it historically, I guess, is the big thing. And then there's a question which is in the chat, which was, can you give some examples of the visual participatory analysis methods you'll be using, I guess, in your analysis? So interpreting kind of quant work.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I think on the question of colonialism, it's probably, I don't think that Samoans really see colonialism as a problem. I think it's almost like a blip in their history, in a sense. It doesn't have the meaning in their everyday lives that it does in other contexts. The thing that is resonates with them far more significantly is the arrival of the missionaries in the early 19th century. So that was significant because it is, to this day, an extremely Christian country. You have 97% of the population who identifies as Christian, and it informs everything that we do and everything that people talk about and your entire life. And so that's a far more transformative process that has happened, that feels very significant in people's lives, and that complicates the conversations around violence against women, because there's a lot of literature that has been written about the ways in which gender relationships have been transformed through the arrival of Christianity. And so I think that plays an enormous role that is really difficult to actually speak about because of the fact that religion is so important in people's lives. And so it becomes this sort of this tension that we have to kind of navigate of saying, you know, how do we work with ministers and work with the church ultimately in order to have a more supportive discourse around gender. So, and on the second question around the participatory visual analysis, so this is really sort of a process, or it's a methodology, I say, that's in process. So it's something that we developed back in Bangladesh when we were trying to share the results of a really, really big trial around diabetes with communities who had actually participated in the trial. And how do we make sense of it? Because it was extremely complicated. The results were complicated and difficult for people to understand. So how do we visually represent those results? And so we spent an awful lot of time working with graphic artists in order to get a simple message about what the outcomes actually told us about people's lives, and then took that back to the communities for a wider discussion about what the results of the actual intervention or the trial had actually shown. And I think what I'm interested in doing is sort of developing it further, because I think that representing things visually is really tricky. And also we would need to represent them differently for different contexts, because people have different sort of knowledge and awareness and ability to engage with visual images as well, or abstractions of data. And so it's a matter of sort of looking at your immediate context and saying, what are the images that people use or see in their daily lives? How do they interpret those? And then using those in order to create something that's a visual representation. So there's not sort of a one fixed way of doing it, I don't think. I think it's about adapting it to local visualizations and local context.
Great, thanks. And thanks ever so much for your presentation. I think, you know, really kind of different and interesting approach, but using the same sorts of ideas, especially around the intervention. So I want to hand over now to Jane Ndungu, who is an NRF postdoc, if I get her title correct, at the South African Medical Research Council, and based out in South Africa for the time being. So over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'll be speaking about a co-development process where we worked with a group of young adolescents who were in school, right? They're all school-going students. And we were trying to understand if it is feasible and possible to co-develop and deliver participatory violence prevention interventions online. And we did this work, it's based on my PhD, and we did it during COVID. So everything was done online from JUMP, and all relationships were developed in the online space. So a bit of background on the work. There is, literature has informed us that there is, next slide, moment, sorry. Yes, there is currently lack of involvement, or sufficient involvement, I'd say, of young people in the design of interventions that are intended for them. So most of the work on young people's lives fails to capture the way issues of gender, sex, and sexuality pervade their lives. Yet, co-development processes would provide us with a very unique and important opportunity to ensure that the voices of the beneficiaries are central to the design. It helps us achieve interventions, and in the process, we also empower young people. So we achieve relevant interventions, and we also empower young people to critically think about their circumstances, which positions them as active agents in driving change in their lives. And this would be very important for adolescents, especially because sometimes we are not in touch with their realities as adults. All right, next slide. So we worked in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa with 4 young school-going adolescents. They were all aged between 18 and 19 years, and we worked over 5 sessions online. And I'll show you what the sessions looked like in the next slide. So in the slide, we'll see we have the length of sessions, which is very important. And I thought that was very interesting. So after the first session where we did sort of introduction, meet and greet with the people, introducing the process and brief discussions on what the process would look like, where we made it very clear that I was just a facilitator in the process, but they were supposed to lead the process. It was their interventions, their ideas were what would shape this intervention, and not my ideas. But you'll see that from the second session to the last session, the sessions kept getting longer and longer. And this was driven by the young people. I did not set a time frame for how long the sessions should be. It was up to at what time do they get tired, what time do they want to switch off, because we had sufficient data. And I really enjoyed looking at that, which I only realized after we were done with the work, that these sessions actually kept getting longer. So in the second session, we defined the problem. The young people defined the problem, which they identified as GBV, and also engaged in discussions on why they thought it was a problem. And in our third session, we got into developing a problem tree, where they looked at why the problem and also some things that can be done to address the issue that they found, which was GBV. On the fourth session, which was very exciting for me, was where young people developed pathways, looking at the drivers of GBV and how these issues led to perpetration or experience of violence. And in our fifth session, they suggested activities. But I'll go back to our fourth session where they developed pathways. And I'll show you an example in the next slide of the kind of work these young people generated. And these are high school adolescents, right, who have not engaged in violence prevention work. They don't have violence prevention training. Yet they were able to think critically on how issues such as poverty can drive violence. And you'll see here with the arrows, shown with the arrows, how they thought poverty eventually leads to violence experience for women in South Africa. And I think the one that was very important or interesting for me was the sex work and how they were able to think poverty would lead to sex work, and then this would lead to men not respecting women and violence. And also, on what you see on this slide is young people's words. We did not paraphrase anything, we did not rephrase. This is exactly as they said it and exactly as they put it, and the arrows are as their thinking was. So what did we achieve in this process with young people, which was very brief and not as lengthy as the other projects that have been spoken about today? Next slide, Mama, please. So the important one was the young people found the process very different from what they expected, because in their schooling, mostly they engage in this work during class and they're used to being lectured. They're told gender violence is wrong. This is what causes violence. This is what should be done. This is what you should not do, sort of to prevent yourself from getting violent, such things. And that's what they were expecting. But when they came to the session, they were very excited at the level of autonomy and depth of involvement in the process. And you can see their eagerness with, what we saw earlier, the length of the session getting longer and longer as we went through them. Days or the intervention development. They were also able to generate many ideas about intervention content and delivery, which is not on the slide today, and how, because they thought this would make the interventions more relevant to them. So how do they want it packaged? It's not only about the content, it's also about how it's delivered to them, right? Which an example would be they thought it's important to have short clips to sort of get their attention. And instead of lengthy discussion, which we would primarily or mostly think would be more effective. They also forced us to think differently about certain issues, such as community, where mostly we define community in terms of geographical proximity, but these young people were able to perceive sense of community online, and they say they do experience that sense of community and connectedness in an online space, sufficient to enable them to disclose private issues. And we saw they thought of shared values and interest as what brings them together, as opposed to how close their houses were. But we also had challenges, which we look at in the next slide. The main one being there and the facilitators, which I was the facilitator, histories of didactic communication, where we're used to mode of instruction, of being schooled, or being told, or being instructed. And that constantly threatened to sabotage the process. The young people kept being afraid. They were very afraid of giving wrong answers, the wrong response. And they kept looking at me for guidance. Is that correct? Does that make sense? Should I have phrased it differently? Yet we were looking to engage them in a dialogical process where they can have honest conversations about what their realities are. On the other hand, I really did struggle not to sort of correct their responses from a scientific stance. So literature has told us, so building on work that's been done for years, on what has the potential to prevent violence. So when the young people, spoke of things that we have tested and tried, and we know they don't have much potential to work, it was very difficult for me not to correct them from that stance. Then there was that constant internal conflict to strike that balance between creating that supportive environment that Andy and I think Laura spoke about earlier, where young people could voice their opinion and engage in discussion without that sense of right and wrong. There was a struggle between that and then correcting them from a scientific stance. So quite honestly, colleagues, I'd say dialogical processes in practice are difficult to achieve. It's very difficult to realize this in co-development process. And I think it's very important for us to think more about this if we are to address the power imbalance in the groups. But we do have some recommendations from the short process that we engaged in the next slide. Please, Mom, thanks. So the first one is for effective co-development processes with learners, it's going to be very important for us to support young people to shift from that didactic kind of approach to dialogical engagement. Only then are we able to really understand the realities of their context. So this will mean creating that supportive environment where learners can voice their opinion and engage in discussion without a sense of correct answers. But it would also require facilitators with strong skills, particularly in the online space. It's also going to be very important for us to build in adequate time for the co-development processes, because this is going to enable the people to shift from describing the broad reality they live in to really sitting and reflecting on their experiences, day-to-day lives, and the experiences they live in. We're very grateful to the young adolescents who worked tirelessly for 5 sessions during their school holidays with us to make this work possible. And to the study supervisors, and is one of them, for the critical insights throughout the study. We are also very grateful to our funders, without whom this work would not be possible. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Jane. Really interesting, and impressed you managed to get young people to give up some of their holidays to do this. I guess I've got a question from the chat, which is something we've talked about. And it's a bit of a hard one. But here you go. I guess one of the questions is, how's it possible for researchers to unlearn what they know about research? And I was thinking of the discussions we've had, and you've flagged a bit around, the evidence based on what works around violence prevention and how to engage that, and what your kind of responses and thoughts are on that kind of bigger question.
I think it's very hard. On the one hand, like you put it, we do have the evidence, and we've seen what we think has potential to work. But we're also challenged as researchers to think, or rather be open to understanding that the realities we have in evidence might be very different from what's on the ground. And we've seen an example of the sense of community that the young people described. So I would say it's very hard to unlearn, especially in practice on the ground, and really be open to listening to young people, and or rather the community participants and what they're saying. But I think it's going to be very important for us to do that. But how to actually achieve that, Andy, I don't have an answer to that. I am grappling with it still, I'd say.
Yeah, thanks. And I think one of the ways we need to think about these things is the idea that everyone is not about privileging one position over the other, but everyone has different interpretations and ways of thinking, and it's about thinking how we can match and build the best parts of that. But it's one of the big questions. Something possibly slightly easier. Did students lead the discussion on implementing solutions? And did you see that change as well, where they, as they went through the process, they got more leadery as such?
They did, and especially the session on developing pathways, where they were looking at pathways. They led the session, that specific session. But the first introduction session, they sort of, were closed off. They were still not very open and, not leading the process. They were waiting to be told what to do. But towards the end, and I believe that if we had more time to develop a full intervention, they would have engaged more fully and led the process more.
Brilliant, thanks. And I think we'll have to stop there and get on to our last presentation with Rochelle Burgess, who's an associate prof at the Institute of Global Health, or for Global Health, at University College London, and she'll be talking about her work in Zimbabwe. So over to you, Rochelle.
Thanks, Andy. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, and happy International Women's Day. So I'm a community health psychologist, and how I often describe that to others is that I am an academic that probably should have just stuck being an activist. But I think part and parcel of that is that I sort of approach my research space and my research practice with an obsession with power and the redistribution of power. And for me, I work largely in the space of global mental health and looking at mental health consequences of various sort of social and political realities. And one context I'm going to talk to you about today is my work in Zimbabwe around the mental health consequences of child, early, and forced marriages. And in this work and in all of my projects, actually, I am really driven by an interest in and the practice of co-production methodologies as a route to transfer of power. And it's a way of doing lots of different things that we've discussed today around sort of recentering knowledge production. But also, I think someone in the chat sort of talked about how this sort of aligns with sort of decolonial principles. And I think that a lot of what we talk about in co-production has very strong lineages to sort of practices around knowing and listening and sharing that come from sort of that sort of history of decolonialization in Latin America and many parts of Africa around things like community-based participatory action research and those types of dialogue interests. But what I'm really interested in today is our work around child marriage. And this is part and parcel with our March Zim project, which is really about the co-production of meaningful mental health interventions for communities affected by child marriage. And we are working in a high prevalence area in Zimbabwe. And I'm going to talk to you about a piece of that project, which is actually co-development within co-production. So it's about to get quite meta, I think, but forgive me, and I'll try my best to go slow and to sort of keep us all on the same page. Next slide, please. So this project, the March Zim project, is a collaboration between a set of partners that represent actors from the NGO space, the sort of public health sector, the Institute of Women Social Workers, and as well as the Academy. So in Zimbabwe, we're working with the women's university in Africa, and then myself at UCL. And this is sort of an example of how we might think of sort of the scale of co-production work as sort of looking across those sort of different sets of actors that Andy sort of started to set out. And really our NGO partners, Rosaria Memorial Trust, have been working in communities across the African continent around ending child marriage, and have a very close relationship with community mobilization efforts in that area. And I know Dr. Naradai, who is the director of this NGO for many, many years before we wrote this project plan together. And so this wider March Sim project, which I'll explain in a minute, is co-produced by these partners. We developed the methods, we based this on sort of a shared platform of our understanding of the different contexts around child marriage and mental health. So next slide, please. And just very quickly, what that sort of means for people who aren't familiar, you know, child marriage is a huge problem that affects around 15 million people, young women every year. And every day, so today on International Women's Day, an average around 40,000 children will be married before the age of 18. And a lot of this particular type of violence against women and young girls it's a manifestation of multiple violences. And so we have structural violence around poverty that drives early marriage. We have experiences of discrete different types of violences against women that occur within early marriages or more likely to occur. And we also know that these rates of child marriage are high in countries where prevalence of poor mental health is really high and access to services, available services, is really low. And so one of the things that we wanted to think about was how could we think about the mental health landscape as well as the child marriage landscape, and sort of combine our efforts in developing supports for this issue simultaneously, so working collaboratively to do that. And in Zimbabwe, where we're working, and specifically in Shamba, which is the district where our project is based, rates of child marriage are very high, with over 53% of young women married before the age of 18. Next slide, please. So out of that context, the wider project of March Zim was born. On the slide here, what I'm trying to show is sort of the overall aims of this co-production project. We're starting from a place where we actually don't know a lot about burden. I think there's a lot known about other types of violences against women, and there's a lot known about mental health needs or prevalence of mental health conditions, but less is known about those intersections. And so what we really wanted to do collaboratively in our project was to try and develop some sort of understanding of what types of mental health conditions might we be worried about in the area, and for young women. And very luckily, in Zimbabwe, we have a locally meaningful measure for mental health that we are able to use, the Shona Symptom Questionnaire. And so we've been working to do sort of a small survey there. But the big part of this project, and the biggest part of this project, is this idea of lived experience. And so we've been doing life history and family history interviews, including sort of a mapping of family networks to try and make sense of risk and understandings of child marriage and the processes of sort of child marriage in terms of how families make decision about it, and how power within household is negotiated, and how people also link and relate these realities to their mental health and well-being, and also their ability to cope with these strategies on their own, and how maybe culture or family networks might be sites of distress, but also have the capability to be sites of empowerment. And so really trying to map out those realities. And based on that sort of knowledge, our team has plans to engage in community-wide conversations to try and develop an intervention. So someone in the audience previously asked, well, you know, who is the participants and who are they? How wide does it go? And for us, we felt that we couldn't build a mental health intervention without talking to the various communities that coalesce around the practice and coalesce around a process of enabling good mental health. And so we have a plan to sort of work with a much wider set of stakeholders beyond survivors to have dialogues around child marriage and ideas for prevention and promotion. And within this community conversations methodology is where we will be doing our co-design. We also are using a method for theory of change that sort of tries to involve much larger numbers of participants. So I think we're aiming between 50 and 100 in these sort of community conversations to do this sort of participatory theory of change. And if people have questions about that methodology, I can sort of liaise with you directly and share it. But ultimately, the outcome of the overall project as a whole was the idea that we, as a community in our local local district, will come up with the dimensions of an intervention that will allow us to address the mental health challenges of the child marriage, and also think about how those practices contribute to the reduction of child marriages in the region. Next slide, please. And then the real world comes up. So I said this has been about 3 years, and we've been working on this project for some time. And we start with this sort of population survey, and we realize that the real world can't wait for research processes. We had really, really high numbers of young women with very high extreme scores on the Shona symptom questionnaire, which led us to be concerned about our ability, I think, to provide support and care and treatment and protection for them. And so we couldn't necessarily wait for our community-wide processes to build an intervention. It would mean that we were leaving lots of young women that we knew to be at risk without care. And the reality of that is because of this scarcity of support within communities. So next slide, please. This is a map of the different types of services that might exist for giving mental health support to young women and girls in Shamba. And the reality is that these services don't exist locally. They exist in Harare, in the capital. And so understanding that and thinking about how we might need to move people to gain access to services, how we do that within the structure of our existing funding and priorities. Despite having hired counselors to sit on our project team, we just knew that we had to do something different. So this is where our sort of new plan emerges. Next slide, please. And this is the sort of rapid co-design of a new intervention, which is a 2-day women's retreat, a supplementary program that my partners and myself sort of designed to try and respond to this very high level of emotional well-being and distress in our community, called Hurukuru Zimu Nyanga. And it is an opportunity for us to sort of come together and create a safe space for women to share their emotions, an opportunity for us to get a more detailed understanding of these high risk women's sort of mental health risks. So specifically thinking about things like suicide, which we knew in the evidence base is very highly associated to early and forced marriage. And actually to give us a chance to sort of think about and deal with that tension of sort of research world needs versus real world needs. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about that co-development process within our co-production process. So I'm again trying to bring it back to Andy's framework. So our intervention priorities were very much driven by our pre-existing equal partnership. So we didn't prioritize just the need for sort of evidence-based practice, but we really wanted to work with the embedded community knowledge that is existing within the NGO about how they have worked with young women in this category in the past, different cultural practices that might be valuable and that people are used to, and as well as the sort of everyday practices of our counselors and our social workers, and using that to create create this program. And we sort of did this as part of our existing dialogical processes and part of our sort of team dialogue meetings, which happen once a month or more frequently, depending on what we need, and really sort of workshopping around that. Next slide, please. So this is the intervention. We brought together the Nyanga methodology, which is a Shona traditional dialogue intervention, which creates a site for intergenerational knowledge transfer, healing, and cultural validation for women. We also drew on the Hurukuro methodology used by our partners at the Women's Institute for Social Workers, which is a local cultural adaptation of problem-solving therapy modalities, which they use quite a lot in working with individuals and communities. And finally, a methodology that I have used around social development activities, which are really important in acknowledging the structural drivers of poor mental health in the lives of women and girls elsewhere in South Africa where I've worked. Next slide, please. And I'm keeping an eye on the time. This is the problem of going last. You have to sort of do everything with whatever's left. So if it is rushed, please know that this is available and I'm available to talk offline if you're interested. So we had this 2-day retreat, which ran over 7 sessions, ranging with opportunities to sort of get women to think about mental health and ways that they can promote their own mental health and well-being with whatever local resources they have available to them. So introducing and encouraging them to think about the relationship between physical health and mental health, introducing them to dimensions around mindfulness and using practices that have been sort of evidence-based elsewhere, running the Nyanga methodology, which is this dialogue and really thinking around of self-care within that space. Trying to create an opportunity for women to build relationships with each other is sort of a pillar across the whole intervention. Next slide, please. We also had within this weekend a specific mental health clinic, which is really set up to give women a chance for one-to-one mental health support with the counselors, in addition to this wide range sort of collective psychosocial support that was targeting some of these other issues. We also encouraged women to sort of build new partnerships with each other. We identified young women who were interested in sort of leading self-help groups back in their sort of local villages. And finally, creating opportunities for women to identify different resources that they needed in order to deal with some of the wider structural issues leading to their poor mental health, setting up opportunities for them to connect with these actors and really thinking about the various forms of capital that women might need to respond to this immediate mental health risk and challenges that we were facing. And a big part of this intervention was that we were allowed to streamline and thinking about how we got individual urgent support to women who seemed to be immediately in need of it and who would be able to be more helped by these sort of psychosocial, wider development-y types of approaches. Next slide, please. So the big, I guess, takeaway message here is that our ability to do this was created by our desire to work within a co-production approach. We were starting from a foundation of trust built over time, but also co-production interventions and projects are designed for that kind of flexibility to allow you to move within projects and be flexible about your project plan. We're still ongoing with the other aspects around the sort of co-development in our original plan. So still planning to go ahead with our community conversations, but we will, when we introduce different models and options to people in those conversations, this model that we've built will be one of them. And at the moment, as a team, we're discussing how to work towards publishing this sort of rapid response, as well as working to evaluate it in a more formal sense as part of our wider body of work. Next slide, please. So that's it from me. I think my obsession with co-production is because it is a process where we build communities of action, collaborative communities that reach across these different identities, knowledge systems, power systems. And it's just really exciting to have a chance to be here today and hear colleagues reflect on all the different ways we can achieve this. So I'll stop there, and thanks for those who've been able to stay behind.
Thanks, Rochelle, and apologies about the rush. And I will, yeah, I think because we are over time, instead of asking questions, I think we'll have to get those questions for you, Rochelle, answered offline, unfortunately. I think what I want to do is just kind of give a quick summary. I think one of the big things that we've tried to do is say co-development of interventions looks very different in very different contexts, but at heart, a lot of the same kind of questions about power, about sharing, and about trying to create receptive listening spaces and voice have been central to this. So it's about balancing different forms of knowledge, not privileging any one form over another. And I think one of the things we also need to do is embrace being transparent about the challenges. And narratives of success are not always useful for learning, and nor are they often honest. You know, things are a lot more complicated. So I'll stop there. I'll hand over to Liz, who will do a very final little close.
Thank you so much, Andy. And before just my few very short closing remarks, Muma, would you mind just sharing the word cloud so everybody can see the words that we have decided mean that co-development, what co-development means to us? If you can, Muma. No, thank you for all those beautiful words. And the big one and the powerful one is collaboration. I just want to say I am so deeply grateful to all of you for joining us. And it really has been a rich and incredibly important discussion. I really want to first just give some final thanks for you, Moma, for sharing with us your excellent production skills. Thank you so much. I want to also give a quick shout out to the World Bank for their funding for the initial early work in Samoa. And I really want to thank you, the panel, to Andy, Jane, Genevieve, Laura, and Rochelle. Thank you for sharing your ideas and commitment to really finding new ways to build interventions that really center the voices of those who really do know what they need and what they want from programs. And as we continue to immerse ourselves in this way of working and addressing our own biases and moving towards this co-development process, I hope we also start thinking more about how to co-write, co-publish, and co-present this work in different ways to different audiences relevant to our co-development partners. And finally, as noted at the beginning, we will be sharing this recording, and the team, the panel, have committed to writing a blog and hopefully a report as an outcome of all these really wonderful discussions, and including some of your really thoughtful questions. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you everybody for being part of this really wonderful webinar. Thank you.